and you're very welcome to another episode of History Now. On today's show, I'm delighted to welcome a very distinguished guest, Professor Eddie S. Glaude Jr. Professor Glaude is the McDonnell Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and he's here today to talk about his excellent recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Today. So, Professor Glaude, I really do appreciate you taking the time out to speak to me. It's an honour for me to get to speak with you. I've just finished the book. It's a wonderful book, but I would want to ask you, James Baldwin is a fascinating character. He remains fascinating for a lot of people, but he's been, he passed away over 3 decades ago. What was it that you thought this is the right time to write a book about James Baldwin's America?
I was dealing with my own despair and disillusionment, trying to make sense of how could the nation elect Donald Trump, someone so visibly unqualified to be president of the United States, and grappling with the fact that the country was doubling down on its racist ugliness. And I knew Baldwin had gone through this, had experienced what I call a moment of betrayal, right after the assassination of Dr. King. And I knew that there were resources in his corpus because I had been teaching him for over 20 years, resources that could help me deal with my own despair and disillusionment. That his America was one, at least during the latter parts of his life, was one in which the country had turned its back on the possibility of a genuinely multiracial democracy. So I wanted to figure out how he picked up the pieces, how he dealt with his own rage, how he continued to love, how he dealt with his disappointment, and how he imagined a new possibility. And what could that offer me as I confronted this America, Trump's America, as it were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, he's remains even 3 decades plus after his death a very engaging figure. And you talk about his hypnotic cadence,
Yeah.
and he's really so engaging. And you see a lot of people, really famous people, like Chuck D, Common, people sharing James Baldwin clips on YouTube still. So he is still very, very relevant for today's America.
Yeah, I mean, during the Black Lives Matter marches, during the Obama administration, you saw signs of Baldwin quotations because a lot of the activists who were in the front lines of that movement were queer men and women. And Baldwin offered a resource for them to imagine their own activism. Reading Jimmy is like, how can I put this? Every sentence is like a universe unto itself. That's why he seems to be so quotable in so many ways. But also, he has a flair for the dramatic. He came of age in what we call here in the States, Black America's first theater, and that's the church. He was a childhood preacher. So, he brought the best of the pulpit with the flair and expertise of someone who studied literature very closely. So, no wonder he continues to. I mean, in some ways, we're just catching up with him. In some ways, that's what I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and in towards the beginning of the book, you talk about Baldwin's understanding of the American condition and how he confronted what you call throughout the book the lie. Now, the lie covers a lot of things. Could you tell us a bit about that, but specifically how it relates to how America views its own history and how America distorts its own history to almost make itself feel better?
Yeah. I mean, I think America is not unique in the lies that it tells itself. I mean, you can imagine the lies that Britain tells itself, or the lies that Germany or Portugal or Spain, however we want to think about it. I think it's inherent to nation states in some ways. But Baldwin wanted to suggest that, America imagines itself as this shining city on the hill, as an example of democracy achieved, as the Redeemer nation. But it does so in order to evade what it has done, that it was a settler colonial state, that it, in some ways, as Baldwin put it in an essay he wrote in 1964 entitled The White Problem, that the Christians who founded the nation had a fatal flaw. They had to come to terms or reconcile the role of chattel in their lives. And the way in which they did that is by saying, in effect, that these men and women were not, in fact, men and women. And because if they were not men and women, Baldwin suggests, then no crime would have been committed. And then Baldwin's line, here's the key. He says, that lie is the basis of our present trouble. So we tell ourselves this story about our inherent goodness in order to protect ourselves from what we're actually doing on the ground that contradicts that imagining, you see. It's a way of protecting our innocence. And even when the ugliness of what we do is revealed, the lie will then descend in order to malform it so that it could then be conscripted back into the story, you see. So think about this in the context of recent US debate, right? The 1619 Project with the New York Times aimed to tell a different story. What does it mean for us to think about the nation's beginnings, not in terms of 1776, but in terms of the Jamestown colony? Well, what happens when you think about it in that regard? Well, immediately, what do we get? We get the reassertion of the lie with the 1776 Project, right? We tell the story in order to malform the facts so that we can maintain our sense of inherent goodness, as it were.
And that's something that's just come back up again with Rick Santorum, given, which has now went viral, millions of views, talking about there was no culture before, white men got to America. How do you think Baldwin would react to that?
I tried to avoid kind of anticipating Baldwin's reactions in words in some ways. He left us with 7,000 pages of words, so I'm sure there's an answer there. But as a reader of Baldwin, you know, Santorum is an idiot. It's just stupid on a certain level, and some at a certain moment, at a certain point, we need to just say that, right? That's stupid. It makes no sense, right? What is the point of the erasure of indigenous culture when we know that the Constitution of the United States is indebted in some ways to the Confederation of Native Peoples in a certain instance, right? We know this, so it makes no sense, right? It makes sense, but it's stupid at its core, and I think we need to call it out for what it is, right? As this desperate attempt to cleave to a world that is dying, that's on the cooling board. That's what it is. It's a cry of someone who wants the world to remain what it was as opposed to what it is becoming.
There's a really interesting term that you use in describing Baldwin, and that is, you say, he's a critic of the after times. Could we talk about what the after times were in relation to his period? And it's very interesting you connect it to the present day and what you call yet another terrible cycle of the tragic history of America. So could we talk about what critic of the after times is?
Right, I get the phrase from Walt Whitman and his important 1871 book, Democratic Vistas. And Whitman, who in so many ways answered Ralph Waldo Emerson's call to sing America, right? We get, recognized that after the carnage of the Civil War, that the nation, what was emerging was this hollowed out space where greed overran everything. This was the dawning of the Gilded Age, right? In some ways. And so the after times is this period of betwixt and between. One world is dying, and another world has not yet come into being. So we're in this liminal state. To use Robert Johnson, the old blues guitarist, we're at a crossroads, right? We're trying, and the question is whether or not you're gonna make a deal with the devil, as it were, right? And so the after times for Baldwin is that, after the Black freedom struggle of the mid 20th century, the response to Dr. King's assassination is the election of Richard Nixon twice. It's calls for law and order. It's the hard hat rebellion of working class white people. It's the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who was as notorious as George Wallace as governor of California for members of the Black Power movement. So the after times is this moment where there is this kind of outpouring where one world is collapsing and another world is desperately trying to come into being, but a door is being shut on one, and then another is coming into existence, right? So here we are in our moment where the age of Reagan is collapsing. The Reagan era has been revealed as being bankrupt, just as Thatcherism is being revealed, whatever you might call it, as bankrupt, or neoliberalism broadly is being revealed to be bankrupt. What will replace it, we're not sure, but we see the ugliness of the moment, right, in full view. That's the after times, where the choice of who we will be is momentous and unavoidable.
So before we get to Baldwin's after times, he very famously went to Paris, and there are very famous clips of him talking about being in Paris and his reasons for going there. Can we talk perhaps about his reasons for going to Paris, and did this provide him with some distance from which he could detach himself from perhaps the role that or the stereotype that white America had defined for him?
Yeah, in the latter interview in the Partisan Review, he says he had to leave the United States because if he didn't, he was either going to kill somebody or somebody was going to kill him. The rage that he saw in his stepfather, the daily cuts of the assumptions of Black people's capacities and deficiencies, the daily insult and humiliation, right, could easily lead one to believe what the world says about you. And then once you believe what they say about you, you're defeated. You're the walking dead at that point, right? And so Baldwin saw this in his stepfather. He saw the anger, the rage, the defeat, and then he saw it in himself. And plus, he had all of these stories dancing around in his head, right? He wanted to become a writer. Baldwin went to DeWitt Clinton High School, wasn't a very good student. He was the editor of the Magpie, some very good people, some very great people he would later go on to do some interesting work with as an adult. But he knew he wasn't what his circumstance suggested he could be, that he would be, right? So he left in 1948 to go to Paris. And, Baldwin tells the story as if he just randomly chose Paris. No, he chose Paris because there was an expat community there, a Black expat community there. Richard Wright was there, right? And it is precisely in that space that he was able to use his language, vomit up what America put in his gut. And there he imagined himself and created himself as the writer that we've come to know. It's a beautiful story, actually. Yeah.
I suppose a follow up question to that would be, did his Parisian experiences, because he was there for quite some time and then back and forth, did they, in any way shape his future activism outside of being a writer?
Well, it gave him the distance, I think, from he's always obsessed. He leaves the United States, but he never leaves the United States, if that makes sense. It is always the object of concern for him. And it impacts being abroad, gave him the requisite distance to think about this behemoth in a way without being in the belly of the beast, as it were. And so I think it certainly shaped, how can I put it? It certainly shaped his personality in a way. I don't know if it, being in Paris defined his activism in the sense that, I mean, outside of the obvious sense that he's not limited to a kind of American exceptionalism, right, where the entire globe revolves around what America's doing, because Baldwin's in Paris, he's in London, he's in Israel, he's in Istanbul. He calls himself a transatlantic commuter, so he understands the global context as well as anyone. Um, but Baldwin isn't Baldwin unless he's thinking about the country elsewhere, it seems to me. Yeah.
And in his own, you look at the confusion around his reasons for returning to America. He, in later years, talks about the very famous photograph of Dorothy Count, who in the school in Charlotte, the the vitriol, the hatred being poured into her. She's the first black student in a white school in that town, and how that brought him back. But that wasn't necessarily the case, was it?
No, so I think this is really important. So in No Name in the Street, the first book published after the assassination of Dr. King, Baldwin tries to commit suicide in '69. Failed relationship, King's murder, deep depression. Um, He's in Istanbul where he's trying to pull himself together in some ways, trying to insist that life matters, that it's worth living. Um, and No Name in the Street is this extraordinary book, um, which aims to kind of give an account of what's happened in this compressed period of time. What's happened between the Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, and Little Rock deconstruction effort to desegregate schools, and the Montgomery Improvement Association with the Montgomery bus boycott, all the way up to this moment where Angela Davis is now on the cover, on the cover of a major periodical and on the FBI's most wanted list. What has happened between then and now? And you would think that would be 20, 30, 40 years, but this is less than a decade, right? About 2 decades at max, right? So you would think it was 50 years of history, but it's really compressed. So in No Name in the Street, Baldwin's trying to narrate this, but he misremembers. And so Dorothy Counts becomes this photo that led him to choose to come back to the States, when in fact that couldn't have happened because the incident was a year later, right? So it wasn't quite right. But the misremembering is important because Baldwin in No Name in the Street is trying to figure out how to narrate trauma. How do you tell history, right? When there's so much death and wound and pain, right? And when we look at trauma studies, when we look at trauma studies, what's fascinating is that memory is fragmented. It's scattered, it folds back on itself. And No Name in the Street is organized in just that way. So the misremembering, to use Toni Morrison's language, of the Dorothy Counts photo matters because it ties to what he's trying to say about Angela Davis, about Bobby Hutton, who had just been killed from the Panthers, about these young folk, about the betrayal that was in full view as he was writing the book.
Would it be fair to say that, and you explore this in the book really well, and it's fascinating, but trauma, and especially, internalizing trauma, can be found right from Go Tell It on the Mountain, where, he's in the white part of New York, he doesn't see that he's fits into the Central Library and things like that. It's, small things that are building up. Would it be fair to say that he's dealing with trauma in his work right from then?
Yeah, I mean, to be Black in this country is to not necessarily be reduced to trauma, but it's to navigate it and negotiate it. It's like, I can't remember the author's name, but I read Milk. It's, gorgeously tragic book, right? And there's a sense in which what hovers over this community, right, is the presence of not only loss, right, but what that loss means and how people see each other, how they interact with each other, how they love, how they fail to love in that sense. So Baldwin, from the very beginning, even in Notes of a Native Son, is grappling with how the reality of America's racist commitments impact the way he is not loved and the way he doesn't feel like he can be loved. You see? So yes, but again, though, we're not reducible to that. This is really important, that the interior life is much more complex, because what happens, and Baldwin was insistent upon this, is that Black folk get reduced to their trauma. We become these flat characters who are only kind of representations of a tangled web of sociological statistics of pathology. That's not, we're much more than that, right? I mean, just listen to the blues, damn it. You could tell immediately that we're much more than that.
Yeah, you've mentioned how the assassination of Dr. King impacted upon him, but he did have it wasn't, you couldn't say it was a friendship, it was a working relationship around, the civil
Hmm.
rights movement. But he did seem to embrace, the younger generation as well, perhaps who weren't as moderate in their tactics as Dr. King, the Black Power movement. Given his stature as an author and a public figure at that point, did his seemingly embrace of the more radical elements of black civil rights, did that come at a cost to his career as a writer or as public persona?
Baldwin should have won a Nobel a long time ago. You know, um, didn't win any major awards in the U.S. literary awards. Um, Many people for a long time wanted to make the argument that Baldwin's literary career could be divided into two parts. The early part where he's at the height of his powers, and as James Campbell, that horrible biography says, right, that Baldwin's voice broke in 1963, that he had become too polemical and too political and given up on his art. I think that's just so wrong. Uh, but Baldwin, I opened chapter one in the book with him in conversation with these young students at Howard Nonviolent Action Group. Many of the students were key figures in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who had seen extraordinary violence in the South, and Baldwin knew what they were experiencing. He felt the fatigue. And he said to them, if you promise your elder brother that you won't believe what the world says about you, I promise you I'll never betray you. This is 63. By 2 years later, two and a half years later, these same students are screaming Black Power. And he refuses to throw them away. So he was there from the beginning. And let's be very clear too, he had a membership in CORE. He helped fundraise for SNCC. I think the class differences were very pronounced in interesting sorts of ways. Baldwin was born not in the Sugar Hill part of New York. He was born in the Hollow, or what we would call the Hood. So those class differences. King comes from preacherly royalty in bourgeois Atlanta. There's a very different kind of material existence defining the two of them, right? Um, so yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
And I think that he still remains to this day very relevant and to young people. When we go on to past that era and we're getting towards the Reagan era, he makes the documentary I Heard It Through the Grapevine and goes and retraces his steps in the American South. So 15, 16, 17 years after he first did it. Can we talk about Baldwin in the Reagan era and why he went there and what did he find?
In so many ways, he's charting the betrayal. We can read it in contemporary terms, right? Every year there's the anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. People talk about what that march in 65 meant. And no one is talking about Selma today. Unimaginable poverty, right? Black people are struggling, sewage bubbling up in their backyards, standard of living, substandard of living. I mean, so you have this celebration of the moment, and then the material reality of the community is ignored. So what Baldwin wanted to do was to show how the nation had turned its back on the promises of the civil rights movement, of the Black freedom struggle. He knew what Reagan was. He knew who he was. And the film, they're filming the footage during the campaign and in the first year of Reagan's presidency. And what he wanted to do was to retrace his steps, right? To go back to Charlotte, to go back to Selma, to go back to New Orleans, and show what has happened there, or more importantly, what has not happened there. Um, and see, this is really important because the 80s, um, because he'd be dead in 7 years. The 80s is a moment when the Black middle class has already decided that it's going to take the bribe. This is going to become the age of Cosby, right? the moment of the very expensive sweaters and the nice, you know, townhouse and and the like, right? Baldwin is still sounding these notes while you have a certain kind of discourse of Black upward mobility and, of course, the Black underclass. Um, so I heard it through the grapevine as this startling and disruptive intervention. Look at what the nation has refused to do. Look at the detritus that has been left behind. So Baldwin says this really quickly. He says, he's not only here to bear witness for those who did not survive, but he's also here to bear witness for those who survived it all, but broken and wounded. And that's the film, you see.
Yeah, and given what you said there about the upward mobility, the Cosby Show, that sort of perception of Black upward mobility, what was the reaction to? I heard it on the grapevine.
Fell flat on his face. It didn't do well at all. It didn't. It wasn't subject to wide release. Very few people have written about it. Um, I think with Begin Again, there's been renewed interest in the film. Harvard has the papers, and you should see the interviews that didn't make it into the film. They're startling. And Baldwin's rage threatens to overrun everything. So it's a pretty fascinating document.
And as you said, the Reagan era was towards the end of his life. He died, at a relatively young age in 1987. But in the concluding chapter, would you write about a new America? And I don't want to try and have you speak for James Baldwin, but you say in it, Jimmy always believed that we could be better than what we are. Do you think that given the time that's just passed, the last 4 years, and what could be around the corner, do you think there's anything that would surprise him?
Nah. When you read the last interview with Quincy Troop, it breaks your heart in the sense that he says in the latter days he felt like a broken motor, saying the same thing over and over again. And he gives you that wonderful line with the Baldwinian flair. You can only go to Texas so many times, right? And then he says, I was right. I knew what would happen if we didn't make these choices. I knew it. I saw it happen. And, America reached for a B-list Hollywood actor in Ronald Reagan. And then they just recently reached for a fake reality actor, a fake billionaire reality actor in 2016, So it's a country that refuses to grow up. It is perfectly comfortable in its adolescence. And that much Baldwin knew. The question for us is, will we ever grow up? That's the question.
Professor Glaude, I really do appreciate you taking time out to speak with me. And the book is called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Today. It's a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really delighted you could speak to me today. So thank you.
It's my pleasure.